troops taking drugs, taking vaccines that were experimental. They didn't know they were experimental. They should have been told. When the FDA gave approval for experimental drugs to be used, they anticipated and had every right to expect that, one, our troops would be informed, and secondly, that there would be proper record keeping. That wasn't done. So the FDA has a role in this process too, because they haven't properly followed up.
I know that we were exposed to a lot of different things. In Kuwait, it was the oil wells. We had 60 oil wells burning next to our tents, and there was never any darkness. I know that they sprayed insecticides and in many different environmental hazards.
And I saw a lot of Marines coming down so covered with oil and so covered with oil smoke, having not seen any sunshine for I don't know how many days, coughing and retching, and so covered it was kind of like one of those wildlife rescues. We couldn't let them light up for a cigarette because we were afraid they'd burn themselves. Even at that time in 1991, we sat outside of our casualty receiving and we said, if this is what's happening on the outside, if this is what they look like on the outside, what must they look like on the inside? What must their lungs look like from breathing this? Because those gas masks, they don't work against things like that. The particles, they don't, and you can't keep them on, it's too hot. You couldn't tell who was white and who was black until they got in a shower. That's how grimy these poor people were.
My husband was with the 143rd MP Company out of Hartford, Connecticut, and they went over to Saudi in January of '91 to guard the POWs. That was their job. They were in the POW camps. He came home in May of '91. Now, while they were there, I know he was given umpteen vaccines. He doesn't know what they were. There were many Scud missile attacks. There was talk, I don't have any proof of it, of Saddam Hussein using chemical warfare against his own POWs because he didn't want them to talk. They were spraying the POWs with lindane, which is a known cancer-causing agent. Now, they were doing this in an enclosed tent with no protection at all, in powdered form in pressurized cans on 12-hour shifts. So they were breathing this, absorbing it through the skin. And I understand now the U.S. Army no longer uses that substance.
There's an aspect of our participation in the Gulf that has not received much publicity, but should. Our use of depleted uranium in the Gulf. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process. Its name implies that this is a harmless material, but in actuality it is still highly poisonous, radioactive, and heavy metal. U.S. and British forces used Operation Desert Storm as a testing ground for the widespread employment of depleted uranium. It is estimated that over 940,000 30-millimeter uranium-tipped bullets, 14,000 large-caliber depleted rounds were used. Between 350 and 800 tons of depleted uranium residue, with a half-life of 4 billion years, permeate the ground and water in Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia.
I was exposed to unspent uranium that was on the armament that I loaded aboard the ships.
How far the sand-sized particles of that spread and inhaling, ingesting it, no one knows.
More and more findings are being acknowledged about the Gulf War syndrome picture, and one of the most important is that our troops were exposed not just to a single toxin, but to a whole variety. So we can't lose sight of the power of synergy. That is, when two or more relatively weak illness-causing factors combine, they can cause precisely the syndrome we call Gulf War syndrome. These symptoms appear to be a type of organophosphate poisoning, report the researchers. What's more, they note that the subtle nerve damage caused by organophosphate poisoning can be missed by physicians unfamiliar with the phenomena.
Shortly after the Persian Gulf War, within 6 months, the veterans came back and started to complain of various illnesses. In the summer of 1993, I was asked by then U.S. Senator Donald Regal to conduct an investigation into the adequacy of health care at the VA hospitals for the Gulf War veterans. And within several days, we came up with a great deal of evidence to indicate that the veterans were exposed to a number of compounds, including possibly low levels of chemical warfare agents that might be contributing to the illnesses that they're suffering.
When we look at the troops overall, some individuals apparently are not sick, some are minimally ill, others are chronically ill, and of course an increasing number are dead. The more time that passes without an appropriate solution to this problem, the more people will lose their lives. I think confusion has been created, perhaps with the public at large and with certain segments of the government, due to the massive number of symptoms that the sick troops present with. Nothing really seems to tie into one specific disease, and therefore Gulf War syndrome is a convenient label that has been attached to this for the moment.
We've found if you do SPECT scans, that almost every vet that has a brain SPECT scan will show brain damage. We've shown that there is a developing problem with vision, which could be connected with the cytomegalovirus upload in our system and that coming out.
You have perhaps 200 to 250,000 that we know are currently sick. You have the death toll standing at, is our best guesstimates, of 10 to 15,000 at this point, not counting spouses, etc. And yet, we cannot get a national epidemic investigation going when the numbers look like potentially 3 million Americans are potentially exposed to this illness.
The cartilage in our joints, many of us, not just me, seems to be disintegrating. So there must be some reason besides time and wearing out factor. I have my right wrist is fused, my left wrist is partially fused, my right knee has just been replaced 5 months ago, my right hip has been replaced a year ago, my left hip's got to be replaced, my left knee, you name it. My hip joints are all, I wake up in the morning, I have such terrible pain in my joints. And all they tell me is just take pain medicine, that you're going to have your joints replaced. So I don't think that's the answer, you know. And why didn't they do something for us before now, before we get falling apart? And like I was saying before, I may be older than most of them, but I'm not the only one complaining about these very same things. I have a 26-year-old friend that they're refusing to do anything for, who has the same problems I have. You know, so there's got to be something to this business of what they bombed us with. I don't think it was just chemicals. I'm very convinced it was biologicals too.
I first realized that there was something wrong with my son in January of 1992, when we found him on the floor in his bedroom with the lights out, banging his head against the floor, suffering from headaches. As we worked with that program, we noticed other symptoms. He was suffering from sensitivity. His eyes were hurt with bright lights. He had loose teeth. He had hair falling out. He had rashes. He had water blisters. He had mood swings. He had weight swings. He had toenails falling out. He had things like aching joints, sleeplessness. All of the issues that have since come to be known as Gulf War syndrome.
I have what is considered a demyelinating disease. The myelin in my brain was unraveling.